All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Welcome back to Theory and Theology. Today we are back with another episode about the Crow Reservation in Montana. So this episode will be covering the topic called residents. So people who live on tribal lands. Now, whether or not these are tribal or non-tribal people, this is what we're going to be talking about. If you like this topic, please check out the topic about hunting and food, as well as the topic about tradition and the intro about Peter Santanella's overall video, and how James and his father Julian were showing everyone around on video on the Crow Reservation. I think they started in Hardin, Montana, I believe. So, I found it important to, post this type of content, even though it's kind of a form of reposting. But I'm not firsthand talking to the people. I'm not on the reservation firsthand. I think I've mentioned, I have Crow heritage that I'm not really all that connected to currently, at least to my own knowledge. And it's always, history and my own kind of genetic makeup has always been interesting and important to me. Just, I remember like when I was younger looking up things in encyclopedias, and then just noticing that as I got older, it's getting easier and easier to come across content. But, up until during the pandemic, there wasn't really a lot of content about Indigenous American groups that was like in the mainstream media. I think the first things I started seeing were, people on TikTok doing like spiritual, cultural dancing, and also coming across people on YouTube and Instagram, just in social media spaces, talking about, the residential schools. And it's not that I didn't know anything before that. It's just, it wasn't always like first on my radar. I did actively take a course in college. I think it was called like Native American History, and I got interested in the local powwow that was held at the college, and I'll probably go this year or the next time they have it. And I was aware of powwows.com since the first time I went when I was in college, probably back in like 2003, 2004-ish. I started getting interested in that website, and then books, just reading books and things. But other than maybe people that I came across that were from different indigenous cultures, or like isuma.tv, more about like Alaskan natives, and I wasn't really coming across a lot of different content. Just like it wasn't being recommended to me. I just wasn't coming across a lot of it easily, and the stuff I came across, it was like a lot of digging, and which I appreciate, which I like, but it was like, I guess my biggest concern is usually because I don't really know where the sources are coming from. I was never really like sure, like, okay, can I even post about any of this, because I don't really know like who's saying this, and like I already don't trust history books. So the first thing I think when I hear like a class, when it comes to different groups of history, I'm already like, I'm not really like buying all of this, but that class was really good. It wasn't like too whitewashed or anything, but it was a little it was more like about it was more like about culture. It wasn't so much about like the historical politics, and I got more interested in historical politics of things, but it was just really hard to come across information. So now that people are speaking out more in social media is like showing different groups of people and talking about how they are experiencing life now, I'm getting a much bigger picture of a lot of different groups of people that are definitely have been, I feel like there's been an attempt to silence these people and an attempt to make it so their stories were not known. The reason why I think that is because of how much time I spend studying cultures and how much time I spend on social media and how many decades it's taken to be able to come across content that's like even modern day, like when they were talking about like Turtle Island and like people getting abducted and all kinds of different topics that you kind of see online and videos going viral and things like that. Like I feel like before there wasn't maybe a lot of that content being pushed or being made known, or maybe it was being hidden. Algorithms have the power to do that. So let's get into the actual topic. When we're talking about residents on the Crow land, James referred to it as checkered, meaning that, it's not all like the tribal people live right here and then the non-tribal people live on this side. It's a combination of people living next to each other, like, maybe there's a couple ranches and a couple houses and a couple trailers, and some of those will be tribal people, some of those will be non-tribal people. But there is some controversy with non-tribal members on reservation land. So they mentioned that reservation tribal lands can be owned or leased by non-tribal members, as well as by tribal members. And a lot of lands were sold at the 1800s prices, the prices that the lands would have cost in the 1800s. Those prices were used for the non-tribal people to buy the lands, and the lands that were being sold had auctions that were hidden from the Crow tribal people. So this goes against what's called Native Crow preference laws. So basically, when the Crow tribal people were trying to buy the land, it usually isn't offered as cheap as those prices from back in the 1800s at that ultra reduced price. And also with Native Crow preference laws, the Crow tribal people are usually supposed to be notified about the auctions so that they'll have the preference. They're supposed to be able to know first. But there's a lot of red tape, it sounds like, either the auctions being hidden from the Crow tribal people, or there's red tape to, being able to get the lands at those prices, even if they do know the price rates aren't really the same. If you think about the current housing crisis with price ranges, everything now in 2022 costs so much more than it even did in 2019. And so with inflated rates, if you think about prices from the 1800s, I mean, I don't even know what the heck, I don't even know what 1800s prices would be, but I remember when I was a kid, from what I remember, even in the 90s, a postage stamp used to cost 25 cents. I remember when gasoline wasn't even $1 yet. And so if you think about most things being about 4 times more than what they used to cost even in the 1990s, I mean, I don't know, in the 1800s, I mean, that's way before, so I can't even imagine. So when non-tribal people own tribal land, there creates other issues, such as not allowing the Crow to hunt on the lands that were leased. And those lands, so if the lands were leased by non-tribal people and then Crow are not allowed to hunt on those lands, it's limiting the amount of land that can be hunted on, for people to sustain themselves. And some of those lands that are being leased to non-tribal people, and the non-tribal people who don't allow the tribal members to hunt on their land, now I'm not saying all, but the amount of them that do, I don't know if it's all, it might be all, it might not be all, but they didn't mention a percentage, but those are traditional hunting areas, and they're leased or purchased by non-natives. And then when you think about businesses, there's what's called unrestricted fee lands. So those are, so with unrestricted fee lands, what happens is a non-tribal member can do whatever they want to do. So there's an example that we'll talk about later on, in another episode, where there's a non-tribal person who has a business property on tribal land, and because it's an unrestricted fee land, they're able to have this business of, selling fireworks. Now, in the state of Montana, there are certain types of fireworks you're not allowed to have, but because it's unrestricted, these non-tribal people on tribal land are able to use that unrestricted aspect to sell whatever they want to sell, do whatever they want to do. And they mentioned that there's a difference between non-Crow versus Crow owning lands, and there's a stricter process for Crow to own unrestricted fee lands. So there's a stricter process in place. If a Crow wanted to own a certain land and make a fireworks stand, there's a lot more strict rules for the process that the Crow have to use to get the land. They mentioned that there's some old rules. We'll talk about this later too. There's some old rules about how, it sounds like there can be like a 15-year process where someone has to prove, in quotes, they're a good Indian, that they know, about business, and they know how to, do what it is that they're gonna do, versus, someone else who just comes in, non-tribal person, anybody from any other place can just come in and just start using the land to do things that wouldn't even be necessarily legal in the state itself. That's why it's called unrestricted. They said that there are chairmen that sign off land and parts of the mountain, and those were being given away. So it's making it so that some of the crow rights are being reduced because of some of the hunting rights being reduced. Some of the amount of available lands to hunt on, or animals to hunt, or they're being restricted with telling them, you can't get past this amount of, you can't hunt past a certain amount, versus before there were no restrictions to the hunting, and, restrictions to getting businesses, restrictions to getting land that's affordable for housing or cheaper housing. I mean, this is on their own tribal land within their own reservation that there are all these restrictions going on. So, I wanted to post about this. I found this very fascinating, terrible, policies being placed against the Crow tribal people, but it's also interesting that it's not mainstream knowledge. I mean, if this was happening in another place, in an American city, in the U.S., on non-reservation land. Now, I understand with history, all the land is indigenous land. But, if you just talk about, how it's kind of set up now, that people were killed, tortured, experienced a lot of hardships, difficulties, different methods of being killed and exterminated, basically, systematically, as well as other ways. Like, I'm in LA right now. This wasn't always just, American people living here. There was no such thing as an American at a certain point. So it's kind of like, okay, if I think about LA, let's use an example like South Central Los Angeles, right? So think about South Central Los Angeles. There are multiple races that live there, but let's just think about modern day. If it was South Central Los Angeles, and I'm just trying to like play this through my mind, so I mean, it's not the same scenario, but I'm just trying to think it through in a way that, might sound more relatable for people. Take a city like South Central Los Angeles, predominantly black in a lot of places in that city, right? If you think, if these specific things were happening, like say there were, people who were not from South Central, that they notice if it wasn't a black person that's not from South Central and wants to own land, they could do it. And the rules are different for those people than they are for the black people living in that city. If the black people wanted to do it, there's red tape. Say, there's no hunting really in South Central. Like, people don't really hunt in LA. It's not really like you hunt in the middle of the city. You might fish in some places. I've seen people fish at the beach or whatever, but off the pier, I don't know. Or out on boats and stuff, but that's not like ultra common. But if you think about that, if people were fishing to sustain themselves in other cities, but then they weren't able to, work or buy stuff in their own city at the same rate or same cost or within the same rules as other people who came from another city. If your driver's license has an address that's in South Central versus someone else whose driver's license is from, a city not too far from there, like Hollywood, Silver Lake, I don't know, Redondo Beach, Long Beach, like whatever. Like, it just depends what your ID says and what race you are. The rules are different. I mean that is true as it is, but it's like there aren't really laws in place about it. It's kind of like the system's set up that way, but also, it's disguised as a form of as equal in South Central. But yeah, I'm not gonna get into the whole thing. But if you think about it just that way, if your ID and your race allowed you different privileges in a city that you weren't even in, that you could go there and get some advantage over a different race and resident status, that would not be okay. Even if you weren't that race, even if you weren't a black person, even if you were, Japanese or Chinese or a white person, you'd probably be like, oh wow, the black people who live in South Central aren't able to buy houses at a cheap rate. The rate is inflated for them. They're not being given, the same rights at all, or, like you would notice it and most people would be like, what the F, like, how is that even like a thing? But I mean, for some reason, I guess it's allowed on a reservation. I don't know why it's allowed. I know that, I'm trying to understand more about what they keep mentioning about tribal government. The structure of the tribal government, kind of how it seems like a corrupt system from what I'm gathering. And it seems like everything trickles down from there, because the tribal government is pretty much controlled and controlling what happens on the reservation, to my understanding. But the tribal government is controlled by the U.S. government. Like, they tell the tribal government what is allowed. The tribal government isn't able to just make up their own tribal laws for their own reservation and stick to it. I mean, they can, but I mean, if there's someone above them telling them how they can and can't do things, it sounds like there's definitely an agenda to not keep things equal for the residents. Not even equal, but for them to not have preference. Like, their preference is being taken away. Their priority is being taken away on almost all levels. And we'll get into different topics too, but I mean, I'm seeing more and more how this is not okay. But also, what's bothering me about a lot of it is not only that it's not okay, but that it's not known. People don't know about it. People don't speak about it. People aren't learning about it. And I mean, it could happen to anybody. It's easy to be like, oh, well, at least it's not me, at least I'm okay. But I mean, as a black person, I don't really say that too much, but I mean, I have my own set of privileges as it is, for sure, but You know, it's some pretty heavy stuff, some pretty deep topics, some pretty I don't know, to me it feels pretty one-sided. Like I try to take a pretty open-minded stance on things. I wonder what the non-tribal people's viewpoints are, even though I almost don't want to know, and I almost don't want to try to justify what they do. Like, I don't see anything wrong with tribal people wanting their own lands and wanting everyone who's non-tribal to not have the same privilege or more privilege than they do on their own reservations. I don't see anything wrong with that, you know, because I mean the cultures have gone through so much. Like, I mean, we could always argue, you know, people can always argue, okay, that's how war is, you know. But, you know, when wars happen, you know, and different people come in and conquer and take over and all that kind of stuff, like, I don't know. I think that there does need to be some kind of limit to what you can do. You know, you can't just bully your way into a space and put up your flag and be like, all right, we're making all the rules now because we can overtake you physically and systemically and whatever else. But I know there are people who believe otherwise, so it's like, how do you even get, you know, people to even see eye to eye on like how to treat these types of people, their situations, their opportunities. They're totally capable of living their own way. They were doing it already. They didn't need other people to come in. They were doing fine. You know, and, you know, I think about it because, you know, another part of my heritage, the majority of my heritage is from, you know, indigenous Africans, which it's like, okay, like, you know, they have their own things happening in those countries, and it's not, you know, the colonialization kind of is just something that, you know, I know that I benefit from it, but at the same time I have a hard time fully agreeing with all of it. Like, it definitely has its luxuries to the structure of things, but, you know, there's also its disadvantages. So and it can kind of create problems, a lot of problems, to have that as like the only method of thinking, the only way to try to do things, that everybody in the world needs to kind of live like that, you know, is kind of crazy to think that way. I like diversity. I like that people have differences. You know, it's I don't know. Every culture has its benefits and has its kind of downsides. But you know, I haven't really yet found a way to really talk about these things because I'm still learning how to even like verbalize what I even think. I've probably hit a topic where I don't really have too much of an unbiased perspective or too much of like a inability to really see multiple sides on some of this. You know, I feel like there is a certain point where there should be a limit. I don't know what that limit is, what it looks like, but with just this topic of, you know, different types of residents on tribal reservation land, and this is just one type of tribe, one reservation in one state. There are multiple tribes, there are multiple bands of tribes, there are multiple different cultures and subcultures and multiple reservations, multiple tribal lands and traditional lands that might not even be on the actual physical reservations. I mean, it's basically just uprooting and trying to force different cultural groups to kind of fit in, like square peg in a round hole, you know, like try to cram this in here, make it work the way that we need it to work, because it won't work if they're just doing their own thing. It'll work for them. And I know the US government does have that stance of like, well, you know, we need this to be, you know, functioning in a way that we can trade with them, that we can have some kind of a political go. That's definitely the way our government operates. We've seen it in the Middle East. We've seen it all over, you know, in East Asia, not East Asia, in, East Asia. We've seen it in, I was gonna say Eastern Europe. I don't know. I definitely have a problem with a lot of it, but, we'll see. We'll see, I mean, how far I can get to learning some different topics. I'm not quite done with this topic about the Crow Reservation, but as far as about the residents, that's pretty much all I can really say. I'm still kind of learning to think about and talk about this type of topic, because it is relatively new to me still, to some extent. But with that, thanks for listening.